Welcome to the plenary talk of the first season of the Keio International Christian University Linguistic Colloquium. As I introduced earlier, I'm Seunghun Lee from International Christian University. Today's talk will be delivered by Professor Barbara Partee, who will be introduced by Shigeto Kawahara at Keio University. Shigeto, go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah.
Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Working?
Yeah, it works.
All right. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Barbara Partee. About this introduction, well, Barbara really is a scholar who needs no introduction, especially from somebody like me. So this introduction is going to be very personal. So Barbara was my first semantics teacher back when I was a graduate student at UMass. Let me talk a little bit about this whole event. This is a plenary lecture for the Keio ICU-Linguistics Colloquium series, co-organized by me and Seunghun Lee, the Master of Ceremony today. So the whole general idea behind this event is to hear from young scholars from abroad, so that scholars in Asia, including us, can learn what's going on. And we wanted more communication between people in Asia and those from abroad. And so we didn't plan on a plenary talk at first. But during this COVID crisis, it's my routine to have early morning walk. And I had a revelation. And what was the revelation? The revelation was like this. Shigeto, you should try inviting Barbara. And of course, the revelation came with explicit reasonings, argumentation. So in the next few slides, I will talk about why the revelation said I should invite Barbara. So reason number one, I'm a phonetician / phonologist by profession, so semantics is not my forte. But I can provide a not very informative description of what did for us, and by non-informative, I mean it in a very strict semantic sense, which is that unlikely to be wrong, have a high probability of being right, and in the information theoretic term, it has low surprisal. So here's my characterization of Barbara, what Barbara did. Before Barbara, Montague grammar was just about logic, and generative linguistics was just about syntax. And Barbara combined these two traditions so that we can explore the semantic component of linguistic knowledge. Okay. Reason number two, I knew that Barbara has been writing a book about the history of semantics, and I always enjoyed hearing and reading bits and pieces of that project. And I actually heard a lecture about this project by Barbara at Rutgers University when I was an assistant professor there back then. And since I enjoyed that lecture so much, I tried to invite Barbara for another conference that was in-person conference that was going to happen in Japan. That was about 5 years ago. But unfortunately, Barbara was unavailable, and I was disappointed. This is an iconic representation of my disappointment. All right, so this is kind of like my revenge. Reason number three, during my graduate training, Barbara always sprinkled her classes with great little tips about academic career in general, and I still take them to my heart. So what are the tips? Tip number one, you don't have to succeed with your dissertation. Dissertation is a just ticket to the whole academic world, and Barbara said her dissertation was okay, not just groundbreaking. Well, if this message comes from anybody, then you can think like, okay, your dissertation isn't great, maybe your research is not just great. But if it comes from Barbara, it's really convincing. So, you don't have to succeed with a dissertation. This was important because I particularly did not like my dissertation either. Well, tip number two, she said, the more non-linguistic articles you read, the better. I think Barbara was specifically talking about those on philosophy and logic, but I took this as to mean that you have to read not just linguistic articles, but articles that are from the related disciplines. And I followed this advice, and I think it did give some breadth to my research. Tip number 3, you will write a number of papers, but there are only going to be only a few that will actually click. So Barbara's own favorite, if I remember correctly, was the one on type shifting. So this is just telling me that, not every paper that you write has to be a home run paper. And most importantly, these advices were always delivered with a lovely smile, which we are going to see today, I'm sure. Reason number 4, Barbara is a good cook. So I think she invites first-year students of UMass Linguistics Department as well as the visitors for Thanksgiving dinner. So it wasn't exceptional for me back then in 2002. So she fed us with great turkey and pumpkin pie together with ice cream. Just for your information, this is me back then in 2002. And you may have noticed that I may be violating one of Gricean maxims. And if you're a student, it's a homework assignment, to figure out which maxim that I'm violating. Reason number 5, it was just a fun class. So it's the same year, 2002, Introduction to Semantics. This was during Halloween period. We needed to dress up as something. And we all decided that we should dress up as a unicorn, the beloved animal in the semantic theory. So my puppy dressed up as a unicorn, and all my classmates dressed up as a unicorn. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of Barbara becoming a unicorn, but I believe she did. And by the way, this is Michael Becker, my classmate, who is now associate professor at the linguistics department at UMass as well. And you may have noticed that I'm already violating that maximum again. Anyway, the consequences already, she hasn't given a talk, but the consequence of inviting Barbara. So for these reasons, I asked Barbara to see if she's interested in giving this online lecture. And to my pleasant surprise, she responded in less than 2 hours and said yes. And without deciding on a title or a date, I tweeted about it in Japanese. And many people in Japan immediately expressed interest. And I didn't know many of them. So I naturally got interested and, trying to figure out who these people are. And they turn out to be philosophers and logicians. So this was a really great surprise, pleasant surprise. My Barbara is known by so many people that I don't know. All right. Going to finish my introduction with this slide about taking the negative as positive with a little bit of semantics in it. So Japanese has a lexical distinction between okage and sei, these two lexical items. They both express a causality relationship. What they differ is their attitudinal meanings. So the former lexical item, okage, implies that the speaker thinks that the outcome is favorable. X happened because of Y, and I like that Y happened. I think English has, it's close to English's thanks to. The latter, sei, on the other hand, implies that the speaker thinks that the outcome is not favorable. So the best translation I can make is X happened because of Y, and it sucks that it happened. And my feeling is that the whole COVID thing is causing a lot of instances of sei. It sucks. And with this, I hope I'm not conveying a wrong message, but dare I say, コロナのおかげでバーバラに講演してもらえることになりました。Thanks to COVID, now we can have Barbara Partee as a plenary speaker for our series. So with this, I would like to pass the microphone to Barbara herself. Thank you.
Okay, so can you see my screen and can you hear me? Is everything fine?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So today I'm going to talk about the intertwining. Oh, no, first I've got to thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. I'm really glad I could come. 5 years ago, I couldn't come. It was harder to get there than it was today. So I'm really, really delighted that I can be here. So I'm going to talk today about the intertwining influences of linguistics, logic, and philosophy in the history of formal semantics. Wait, where's the one that will, oh, come on. There we go. So formal semantics, as it has developed over the last 50 years, has been shaped by fruitful interdisciplinary collaboration among linguists, philosophers, and logicians, among others, affecting and affected by developments in linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, and computational linguistics. There have been centuries of studies of logic and of language, and until the late 19th century, the disciplines of logic, psychology, and linguistics were not yet separated, and issues of logic, thought, and language were often discussed together and closely intertwined. Today, drawing on the book project that Shigeto mentioned, I'll trace the background and history of formal semantics, describing some of the pivotal advances and controversies that have shaped the field. A key theme is the challenge of developing a compositional semantic theory for natural languages, a challenge in which quantifiers have played a big role. And I'll close with a brief discussion of some foundational issues concerning the nature of human semantic competence. So semantics traditionally meant quite different things to linguists, philosophers, and psychologists, since different fields have different central questions and different methodologies. Philosophers have long been concerned with truth and reference, with logic, with compositionality. I haven't defined that yet. I should define it just briefly. I think how you get the meaning of the whole from the meaning of the parts, right? With compositionality, with how meaning is connected with thought, with the analysis of philosophically important terms. Linguists, ever since the Chomskyan revolution, care about what it is that's in the head of a speaker of a language and how it's acquired. Psychologists have experimentally studied concept discrimination, concept acquisition. Emphasis is on the lexical level. Syntax has had a big influence on linguists' notions of what logical form might mean. Structure of meaning to a linguist suggests tree diagrams or something of that sort. Logicians build formal systems with axioms and model theoretic interpretation. Structure to a logician suggests inferential patterns or maybe algebraic structures. Formal semantics has roots in several disciplines, most importantly logic, philosophy, and linguistics. The most important figures in its history were Richard Montague, whose seminal works date from the late 1960s and beginning of the 70s, and David Lewis, whose major contributions span the 1970s. There were many other important contributors. None will get their fair treatment today because the story is too big and time is too short. But let's back up a little bit to some prehistory. So semantics and linguistics in the earlier times. So let's say before syntactic structures, Chomsky's 1957 landmark book. In the 19th century, linguistics existed within philology in Europe and in large part within anthropology in the US. Detailed descriptive lexical semantics was important for philology, and semantic fields like kinship terms were important for anthropology. But that wasn't a whole lot of semantics. It wasn't semantics as we know it now at all. In the 20th century, like so many other fields, linguistics emerged as a science. Part of the Chomskyan revolution was to view linguistics as a branch of psychology. Now we think of it as cognitive science. There were negative attitudes to semantics in American linguistics in the 20th century, partly influenced by logical positivism and by behaviorism in psychology. The neglect of semantics in early American linguistics was also because of the big fieldwork tradition. Start with phonetics, then phonology, then morphology, occasionally get to a little syntax, but not much more. Semantics in logic and philosophy of language was making a great deal of progress in the 20th century, but that was relatively unknown to most linguists. In 1954, Yoshua Bar Hillel wrote an article in Language, the Journal of the Linguistics Society of America, inviting cooperation between linguists and logicians, arguing that advances in both fields would seem to make the time right for an attempt to combine forces to work on syntax and semantics together. He was arguing against those logicians who considered natural language too unruly to formalize, and appealing to linguists to make some use of the methods that logicians had been developing. Why does this not want to? Wait, did I skip? Yeah. Then in 1955, right after that, Chomsky, who was then a PhD student, wrote a reply in that same journal, Language, arguing strongly that the artificial languages invented by logicians were so unlike natural languages that the methods of logicians had no chance of being any use for linguistic theory. Chomsky and Bar Hillel were good friends. They remained good friends, but Chomsky disagreed with that appeal that Bar Hillel made. Bar Hillel didn't give up, though. He was also friends with Montague, and in 1967, he wrote to Montague after receipt of one of Montague's papers, and he wrote, "It will doubtless be a considerable contribution to the field, though I remain perfectly convinced that without taking into account the recent achievements in theoretical linguistics, your contribution will remain one-sided." Also in 1967, during the Third International Congress for Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science, Bar Hillel organized a symposium in Amsterdam, trying to get linguists, logicians, and philosophers together on the role of formal logic in the evaluation of argumentation in natural languages, with a whole array of very interesting people. And Montague was there, and Jerry Katz, who was a colleague of Chomsky's, was there. And they didn't understand each other at all. But back to our history. Chomsky concentrated on the native speaker's ability to produce and understand a potentially infinite class of sentences. His conclusion, linguistic competence must involve some finite description of an infinite class of sentences. His formulation of the goals of linguistic theory revolutionized the field. But Chomsky has been ambivalent about semantics. He's been skeptical about the possibility of including semantics in a formal grammar, and has always insisted on the autonomy of syntax. But he has held that one test of a syntactic theory is that it should provide a basis for a good semantics. If only we had any idea how to study semantics. So Katz and Fodor kind of took up that challenge, and they added a semantic component to generative grammar. They addressed what they called the projection problem, i.e. compositionality, how to build up the meaning of a sentence from the meanings of its parts in a rule-governed way. At that time, just to illustrate the issues, negation and question formation were both transformations of declarative sentences. Those are prime examples of transformations that change the meaning of the sentence they applied to. So the meaning of a sentence depended on the entire transformational history of that sentence. P markers, or phrase structure markers, that mark the structure of the kernel sentences, they were extended to what Katz and Fodor called T markers that showed the whole derivational history, including transformations. And projection rules, semantic projection rules, applied according to that whole derivational history. Katz and Fodor's idea of computing the meaning on the basis of the whole T marker can be seen as aiming in the same direction as Montague's later idea of derivation trees and Haskell-Curry's independent idea of tectogrammatic structure. So just to illustrate, only not very fully, a T marker for the sentence, "the airplanes will not fly," would include a little phrase structure tree that would be a P marker for its deep structure. I've just illustrated that with some bracketing in 3A. Plus a graph, here just one extra node in the graph, showing what transformations have been applied in its derivation. So here, will fly onto the airplanes will not fly. So their idea was if you knew how to work out the meaning of the airplanes will fly on the basis of its P marker, and then you knew what T neg did semantically to a sentence, you'd get the meaning of the airplanes will not fly. There's Jerry Katz on the left and Jerry Fodor on the right. But their semantics was very primitive. Katz and Fodor worked with semantic features on the analogy of phonology, and their semantic representations were just bundles of features, suitable at best for decompositions of one-place predicates into simpler predicates. Quine, in his classic book, Philosophy of Logic, in 1970, wrote, "Logic chases truth up the tree of grammar." Katz and Fodor's position might be characterized, semantic projection rules chase semantic features up the tree of grammar. What they were trying to capture had nothing to do with truth conditions. They didn't ever say a word about truth conditions or think about them. They were trying to capture properties like ambiguity, synonymy, semantic anomaly, analyticity, characterized in terms of how many readings a sentence has or whether two sentences share a reading and things of that sort on a very structural level. Lewis gave a very strong example of the philosopher's reaction to semantic representations. This is from his 1970 paper, General Semantics, which is a very influential paper. He wrote, he called their little semantic marker descriptions marqueries. And he wrote, "We can know the marqueries translation of an English sentence without knowing the first thing about the meaning of the English sentence, namely the conditions under which it would be true. Semantics with no treatment of truth conditions is not semantics." And then he wrote, "Translation into marqueries is at best a substitute for real semantics, relying either on our tacit competence at some future date as speakers of marqueries, or on our ability to do real semantics, at least for the one language marqueries." But linguists did presuppose tacit competence in marqueries. They took that or some kind of representation language to be universal and innate. Many still do. I think Jack and Doff does. I think Jerry Fodor always did. But to philosophers and logicians doing formal semantics, the language of marqueries looked empty, since it was what logicians would call an uninterpreted language, just strings of symbols. The linguists in 1970 concerned with truth looked just puzzling. Linguists were trying to figure out mental representations that would underlie linguistic competence, and usually thinking some kind of tree structures again. Actual truth was correctly considered irrelevant, and the notion of truth conditions was not really understood. When the linguistic relevance of truth conditions for semantics finally penetrated later, this was part of the Montague revolution, the very nature of linguistic semantics changed, not just in terms of the tools used, but also in the questions asked and in the criteria of adequacy for semantic analyses. Now, in a theoretically important move that was separable from the marqueries issue and related to the problem of compositionality, Jerry Katz and Paul Postal in their 1964 book made the innovation of putting morphemes like negation and a question morpheme Q into the deep structure, arguing that there was independent syntactic motivation for doing so. And then the meaning could be determined on the basis of deep structure alone. That was a big deal. So instead of the negative transformation adding negation to an affirmative sentence, negation was there as a morpheme in the deep structure, and what the negative transformation in each language would do, because probably every language would have such a transformation, would tell you how you express it, where you put negation, how it's morphosyntactically realized in that language. And similarly for question transformation, put a Q in the deep structure, and then the question transformation just tells you how you pronounce that, how you turn that into a surface structure. So question, Mary has visited Moscow, gets mapped onto has Mary visited Moscow. This led to a very beautiful architecture, which Chomsky laid out in his 1965 book, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. So you have base rules, the phrase structure rules, generating deep structures, and deep structures are the input to the semantic interpretation. Then transformational rules map deep structure to surface structure, and surface structure is the input to the phonological component. So the mapping from meaning to sound goes by way of the syntax, which gives you deep structure and surface structure. It was really very pretty. And this big change in the architecture rested on Katzenpostel's interesting and provocative claim that transformations must be meaning preserving, a claim which led to interesting debates, even without any real semantics in David Lewis's sense at the foundation. And Chomsky, in aspects, added to the elegance of the architecture by combining what used to be separate little kernel sentences that all fed into a complex sentence. He combined them all into a single big deep structure that had recursive structure within it. During the brief period when Chomsky's aspects held sway, there was a rosy optimism. I know, this was when I was a graduate student. My degree was 65. There was a rosy optimism that the form of syntactic theory was more or less understood, and we could go out into the world and start trying to figure out the substantive universals, write grammars of lots of languages, see what they all have in common. And it looked like the theoretical work was basically done. Now we could do more substantive work. And the idea that meaning was determined at this deep level was undoubtedly part of the broader appeal of the notion of deep structure beyond linguistics. For instance, Leonard Bernstein's Norton lectures, The Unanswered Question, refer to deep structure and surface structure in music. And it probably contributed to the aura surrounding the knowledge as a window on the mind. So that was the Garden of Eden period. What led to expulsion from the Garden of Eden? Well, a surprising historical accident is that the behavior of quantifier phrases with respect to transformational rules familiar from syntactic structures and aspects was not really noticed until the point where the Katzenpostel hypothesis had, for linguists, already reached the status of a necessary condition on how you write your rules. They should write them so that they never changed meaning. I believe that this historical accident was one of the major causes of the linguistic wars between generative semantics and interpretive semantics. On the next slide, I will give a few examples of derivations that would have been given in the aspects theory, where the examples given, like all the examples linguists threw around back then, typically involve proper names like John and Mary, not quantifier phrases like every man or no man. And we will see that in examples with names, the transformations I will illustrate are meaning preserving. But if you take the same kind of structures and you put in quantifier phrases instead of names, then the transformations radically change the meaning, and it may change in different ways with different quantifiers in a way that you could never write a single uniform rule for what the change would be. I suspect that the Katzenpostel hypothesis would never even have been suggested if such quantifier examples had been noticed earlier, and the history of syntax and semantics would have been different in ways that we can't exactly predict from this vantage point. So here's the four examples I want to mention. So take the reflexive transformation. With names, John voted for John would be the underlying structure that would be transformed into John voted for himself. That's fine. That's what John voted for himself means. But every man voted for every man certainly should not be the underlying structure for every man voted for himself if you want your transformations, if you want the deep structure to show you what the meaning is, right? But that's what would happen. You get that big meaning change if you applied that transformation. Equinoun phrase deletion gets Mary wanted to win from Mary wanted Mary to win. That's fine. That's meaning preserving when it involves names. But if you derive every candidate wanted to win from every candidate wanted every candidate to win, that's not meaning preserving at all. Similarly, 3 is even and 3 is odd. Fine, that's a fine deep structure for 3 is even and odd. I mean, it's a false sentence, but the deep structure and the surface structure are both false. That's fine. But what's the deep structure for no number is both even and odd? Well, this transformation would say that the deep structure is no number is even and no number is odd. Semantically, you don't want that, right? And one more, relative clause formation. From the pacifist fought and the pacifist was inconsistent, one derived the pacifist who fought was inconsistent. That's not quite okay semantically, but it was reasonable enough that nobody fussed about it back then. But if we had noticed that was saying we would derive all pacifists who fight are inconsistent from all pacifists fight and all pacifists are inconsistent, well, we would have noticed and fussed about that. So there was the problem. This lovely combination of deep structure and the Katz-Postel hypothesis was immediately seen to lead to these terrible results. And when linguists did start worrying seriously about quantifiers in the 60s, one big puzzle concerned quantifier scope ambiguities. I just mentioned this kind of on the side. A sentence like every student read one book is semantically ambiguous, although there's little or no evidence that it's syntactically ambiguous, and in aspects it wasn't. It just has a simple phrase structure, no transformations in its obvious syntax. The Katz-Postel hypothesis, and hence aspects, did incorporate the compositionality principle, that the meaning of a whole is a function of the meanings of its parts and how they are syntactically combined. And in aspects, the relevant syntactic structure was deep structure. But we've seen when quantifiers were discovered, we saw that failed. It just didn't work. So what happened? What do we do about this failure? Well, this is where the split came. Generative semanticists who were one side in the developing linguistic wars, they kept the goal of compositionality. They cared about the semantics, but they said, oh, we have to push our deep structure deeper. The deep structure for every student read one book it's got to have two deep structures, and each one has to look more like what the structure logicians would give to the two readings of that sentence. And the deep structure for every professor voted for himself has to look more like what a logician would assign with variables and quantifiers. Chomsky, on the other hand, had been quite tentative about adopting the Katz-Postel hypothesis. It looked nice when it seemed like it would work, but he was unsure we knew enough about semantics to be very sure of it. And he valued syntactic autonomy more highly, that he was sure of. So he and the interpretive semanticists like Jackendorf abandoned the Katz-Postel hypothesis and kept their syntax at first more or less the way it had been in aspects, evolving in ways motivated just by syntax. Okay, so now we have the linguistic wars of the late 60s and early 70s raging. Now let's back up and turn to a little history in philosophy and logic. The relevant history in philosophy goes back at least to Aristotle. For today, there's no time. All I'll say about Aristotle was that his logic was so elegant that his syllogistic treatment of quantifier sentences became like a Bible for centuries. And that left sentences with more than one quantifier, like what was the one I had on the previous page? Every student read one book. Aristotle didn't treat those sentences. Those sentences were ignored until the 19th century. So he did great things, but he, in a way, he might be said to have impeded progress, or not. He didn't impede progress. He wouldn't have kept the same ideas for 1,500 years, but he was treated like a Bible. That impeded progress. The history of the formally oriented approach towards the philosophy of language goes back at least to Descartes and Leibniz. Descartes, like the medieval speculative grammarians, believed that underlying all speech there exists some kind of a universal language. But what it represented was the form of human reason. It was an internal thing. It didn't reflect the nature of things in the world. Leibniz developed Descartes' idea, calling the general framework of such a universal language a characteristica universalis, based on an ars combinatoria, an art of combining, a system of symbolization that would have simple forms for simple concepts and unambiguous logical forms displaying the logical structure of all complex expressions. Together, those should provide a logical analysis of all the actual and possible concepts that might arise in science. And the framework was to include a kind of an automatic calculating system, a complete system of deduction that would allow new knowledge to be derived from old knowledge. It was just a dream, but it was a beautiful dream. In the 19th century, George Boole had an algebraic conception for a system governing what he called the laws of thought, a kind of calculus ratiocinator, independent from the vagaries of natural language. Boolean algebra does turn out to have widespread application to natural language semantics, whether Boole would like that or not. But the greatest foundational figure for formal semantics is Frege. His crucial ideas, there are many crucial ideas that we got from Frege mainly. The idea that function argument structure is the key to semantic compositionality. Some expressions are interpreted as functions, other expressions are interpreted as things that can be their arguments, and to put the meanings of two expressions together is to apply a function to an argument. Frege is also credited with the principle of compositionality. The meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meanings of its parts and of the way they are syntactically combined. And Frege introduced the distinction between sense and reference, Sinn and Bedeutung, which philosophers and semanticists have been trying to formalize adequately ever since. One of Frege's great contributions was the logical structure of quantified sentences. That was part of the design of a concept script, the Griffschrift, a logically perfect language that could satisfy Leibniz's goals. Frege did not see himself as offering an analysis of natural language, although he talked about it and he has rich discussions in his papers. But what he saw himself as offering a tool to augment natural language as the microscope augments the eye. The eye is wonderful. Eye is a wonderful thing, and so is natural language, but sometimes we need something that augments it for special purposes. Frege also figured out a systematic and compositional semantics for variable binding, prefiguring something that Tarski did in a more well-known way 50 years later. Now, one interesting thing about Frege that I'll mention now and then come back to this issue at the very, very end was many of Frege's predecessors took logic to be a part of psychology. And Frege rejected that psychologism of his predecessors, including John Stuart Mill. So Mill said logic is a branch of psychology. And Mill said, so far as it is a science at all, logic is a part or branch of psychology, differing from it on the one hand as the part differs from the whole, and on the other as an art differs from a science. He took logic to be an art and psychology to be a science. Its theoretical grounds are wholly borrowed from psychology and include as much of that science as is required to justify its rules of art. Well, as you can see, the conception of logic that lies behind this is logic as prescriptive rules for correct argumentation, how to avoid fallacy, what you learn when you learn rhetoric and such things. Because there wasn't formal logic then. But one of Frege's main theses is that mathematics and logic are not part of psychology, and he saw logic more like part of mathematics, and that the objects and laws of mathematics, and that's supposed to say mathematics and logic, are not defined, illuminated, proven true, or explained by psychological observations and results. One of Frege's central arguments for this thesis is the consideration that whereas mathematics is the most exact of all science, psychology is imprecise and vague. Frege claims that in the realm of logic, we find both descriptive and prescriptive laws, with the former, the descriptive ones, being the foundation for the latter. He wrote, every law that states what is can be apprehended as prescribing that one ought to think in accordance with it. This holds of geometrical and physical laws no less than logical laws. His main criticism of psychological logic is that it conflates true with being taken to be true by a human thinker. Psychologism remains a foundational issue in semantics and philosophy of language, and I'll say a little more later. Bertrand Russell introduced logical types to avoid paradox, using them to impose restrictions on well-formed function argument expressions. Early Carnap used the theory of types syntactically for logical construction of the world and the logical construction of language. Later, Carnap came to appreciate semantic approach, and he developed a semantic approach himself, where meanings are truth conditions, an idea he got from early Wittgenstein, an idea rejected by late Wittgenstein. Carnap introduced possible worlds. He introduced them as state descriptions, very different from what Tarski and Montague did later. But he had the idea of analyzing intensions as functions from possible worlds to extensions. That's an idea that Montague accepted from Carnap. Tarski developed model theory based in set theory, and with it made major advances in providing a semantics for logical languages, including his semantical definition of truth. Before Tarski and the model theoretic approach, logicians would argue about whose modal logic is correct, and they would just argue by showing the inferences that you draw and saying they like this inference better than that inference. And after Tarski, you could start seeing, this set of axioms will have these models as a result, and this set of axioms will have these models. You say, oh, this one might be good for deontic logic, and this one might be good for logic of truth and necessity, etc. I can't do justice to that in just a sentence or two. But here's Carnap on the left and Tarski on the right. Both of them were major influences on Montague's work. Tarski was Montague's teacher. But more, this one among the philosophers, the ordinary language and formal language wars. So in the 1950s, a war began within philosophy of language between the ordinary language philosophers and the formal language philosophers. Ordinary language philosophers rejected the formal approach that was pushed by Russell and others and urged attention to ordinary language and its uses. The ordinary language philosophers include late Wittgenstein, Strawson, Austin, Ryle. So Strawson, reacting to Russell's treatment of definite descriptions, wrote a paper on referring, writing about definite descriptions like the king. And he said, the actual unique reference made, if any, is a matter of the particular use in the particular context. Neither Aristotelian nor Russellian rules give the exact logic of any expression of ordinary language, for ordinary language has no exact logic. Russell, 57, in a short paper called Mr. Strawson on referring, starts out totally unable to see any validity whatever in any of Mr. Strawson's arguments. Later, near the end, he says, I agree, however, with Mr. Strawson's statement that ordinary language has no logic. So actually, both sides in this war, like Chomsky later, were in agreement that logical methods of formal language analysis do not apply to natural languages. Well, actually, like Chomsky at the same time when he was replying to Bar Hillel. That is right around that same time. Terry Parsons, who was my colleague here at UMass when we both first came here, we both first arrived in 72, yeah. He reports that when he started thinking about natural language in the late 60s, he was very much aware of the tradition from Russell that the grammar of natural language is a bad guide to doing semantics. But on denoting, he realized Russell had produced something like an algorithm for going from this bad syntax to the good semantics that he recommended. That would suggest that natural language does not have such a bad syntax for expressing meaning, including the meaning of sentences with quantifiers, definite descriptions, and the other things that Russell cared about. Formalists like Russell generally advocated replacing natural language with a formal logical language for purposes of exact reasoning, just as physicists use mathematical formulas. In this, they were like Frege, seeing formal logic as an aid to natural language, not an analysis of natural language. The interesting response of some formally oriented philosophers in these debates was to try to analyze ordinary language better, including its context-dependent features, which the ordinary language philosophers said were not represented at all in the formal languages of Russell et al. So the generation that included Pryor, Bar-Hillel, Reichenbach, Curry, and Montague gradually became more optimistic about being able to formalize crucial aspects of natural language. Arthur Pryor made great progress on the analysis of tense, which is one central source of context dependence in natural languages, and it had been completely omitted from earlier logical languages. So it was not until Pryor's work that we began to have tense logics. Montague, a student of Tarski's, was an important contributor to these developments. His higher order typed intentional logic unified tense logic and modal logic, extending Pryor's work, and more generally unified a kind of formal pragmatics with intentional logic. Montague also generalized the intentional notions of property, proposition, individual concept, etc., into a fully typed intentional logic, extending the work of Carnap, Church, and Kaplan, putting together Frege's function argument structures with the treatment of intensions as functions to extensions. I'm not explaining all these here, so I have to depend on you finding some of the references to works that I mentioned to understand more. But what made Montague's approach daunting and hard for us from coming from outside that tradition to read also made it powerful. The type structure made it possible to have semantic types not just for sentences, predicates, and terms, which was all you could represent with first-order logic, but for determiners, determiner phrases, noun phrases, modifiers, degree phrases. That made it much easier to work compositionally while using an independently motivated syntax of the kind that linguists would be happy with. Why did Montague turn to work on natural language? As a student of Tarski's, that was quite an unexpected thing for him to do, because all of Tarski's students were taught to value deep theorems in some kind of logic. I found a clue about Montague's motivations when I had a chance to look in the Montague archives at UCLA. There was a handwritten yellow page preamble to an early talk handout for his paper, English as a Formal Language, one of his very first papers on natural language. I had to decipher his shorthand, but now I'm quite sure I've got it right. So he didn't put in the handout, but said before the talk, this talk is the result of two annoyances. One is the distinction some philosophers, especially in England, draw between formal and informal languages. And the other is the great sound and fury that nowadays issues from MIT under the heading of mathematical linguistics or the new grammar, a clamor not to the best of my knowledge accompanied by any accomplishments. I therefore sat down one day and proceeded to do something that I previously regarded and continue to regard as both rather easy and not very important, that is, to analyze ordinary language. You just imagine me when I discovered that paper, having already committed my whole professional life to trying to get Chomsky and Montague together. But Montague continued, I shall, of course, present only a small fragment of English, but I think a rather revealing one. He had an inserted note to mention there does exist other creditable work, like traditional grammars, and Ijukiewicz and the computational logicians Boner and Backer and Hanskamp, his student. Later notes from the archives, as he was working on his last paper in 1970, do suggest that he eventually found it not entirely easy. There are a lot of notes about constructions that he thought about that he didn't put into any paper because he couldn't figure out solutions that he was happy with. Montague's first work on natural language was the provocatively titled English as a Formal Language. Montague had taught that material at UCLA in the spring of 1965, when Comp was a student there, and at the University of Amsterdam in spring of 66. English as a Formal Language famously begins, "I reject the contention that an important theoretical difference exists between formal and natural language." As noted by Emmon Bach in his nice book, Informal Lectures on Formal Semantics, that started from lectures he gave in China in 1984, the term theoretical here must be understood from a logician's perspective and not from a linguist. What Montague was denying was the central presupposition of the formal language, ordinary language wars, the presupposition that there's a big mismatch between linguistic form and logical form for natural languages. What he was proposing here and in his more theoretical paper, Universal Grammar, was a framework for describing syntax and semantics and the relation between them that he considered compatible with existing practice for formal languages and an improvement on existing practice for the description of natural language. The Fregean principle of compositionality was central to Montague's theory and remains central in formal semantics. Montague's syntax-semantics interface is that syntax is formulated as an algebra of forms, of expressions. Semantics is an algebra of things that we can count as meanings. You can decide what you want to count as meanings, but you should structure them as an algebra. And compositionality is the requirement that there be a homomorphism mapping the syntactic algebra into the semantic algebra. The nature of the elements of the syntactic and semantic algebra is left open. All that's constrained, but it's a big constraint, is the relation between them. The differences between Montague's higher order typed intentional logic and first order predicate logic, which was all that linguists knew at the time, made a crucial difference for the possibility of giving a compositional semantics based on a relatively conservative syntax for English. Relatively conservative, I mean, as opposed to what the generative semanticists thought they had to do, which was to make a deep structure that looked a whole lot like the structure of first order predicate logic. Once Montague had shown what could be done with the use of model theoretic techniques for compositional semantic interpretation, and with a higher order intentional logic, linguists and philosophers set about coming up with extensions and modifications of his ideas to fit natural language phenomena even better. Many aspects of Montague's own analyses of the semantics of English have been superseded, with major linguistically motivated innovations by Comp, Parsons, Heim, Kierkegaard, Ruth, Roberts, many others. But in overall impact, Montague's first works were as profound for semantics as Chomsky's were for syntax. Emmon Bach summed up their cumulative innovations this way. Chomsky's thesis was that English can be described as a formal system. Montague's thesis was that English can be described as an interpreted formal system. And in the interpreted formal system, truth conditions and entailment relations are basic. That was something linguists had never heard of before Montague and David Lewis. These are minimal data that have to be accounted for to reach what Chomsky would call observational adequacy, to get the bare facts right. That principle, inherited from the traditions of logic and model theory, is at the heart of Montague's semantics and is one of the defining principles of formal semantics. Creswell put this in the form of what he called his most certain principle. We may not know what meanings are. Philosophers of language have been debating and are debating what meanings are forever. But we do know that if two sentences are such that we can imagine a situation in which one of them is true and the other false, then they do not have the same meaning. That's a very minimal kind of condition, and that we can be very certain of. And it turns out that many decisions about semantic analysis, both in general architecture and in particular instances, can be shown to follow from that principle, as Creswell and others showed. The advent of truth conditions and the tools of model theory made semantics an incomparably more powerful discipline than it had been before in the world of linguists. It may be hard to realize just how surprising and controversial an idea it was to linguists in the early 70s that we should think about truth conditions and entailment relations rather than just thinking about ambiguity, semantic anomaly, and synonymy. Synonymy being a very difficult thing to get a handle on anyway. So what followed was joint by linguists and philosophers. So this was what led to Montague grammar and the development of formal semantics. Montague was doing his work on natural language at the height of the linguistic wars between generative and interpretive semanticists, though Montague and the semanticists in linguistics had no awareness of each other in those early years. The earliest introduction of Montague's work to linguists came from my first papers and from Rich Thomason, who published Montague's collected works with an introductory chapter in 1974. Thomason and I both argued that Montague's work might allow linguists to have a syntax semantics setup where the syntactic structures generated could be relatively conservative, syntactically motivated in linguist sense, and with relatively minimal departure from direct generation of surface structure, while offering a principled way to address many of the semantic concerns that motivated some of the best work in generative semantics. I mean, one way of caricaturing generative versus interpretive semantics is the interpretive semanticists insisted on taking syntax very seriously, and the generative semanticists insisted on taking semantics very seriously, and nobody before Montague and David Lewis and the things we could do with their work had found a way to take both seriously at the same time. Let me review an obstacle I faced when I started trying to put Montague and transformational grammar together. The solution is related to a leading idea that came into linguistics from philosophy and logic in this period, namely the Fregean idea that recursion should be done on open sentences. You don't take closed sentences with all their quantifiers already in them and try to do recursion by nesting them inside each other. So here was the problem I faced when I was starting to try to put these things together. What to do about syntactic deletion rules. In classical transformational grammar, as I mentioned earlier, a sentence like Mary was eager to win would be derived from a sentence like Mary was eager for Mary to win by deleting one of two identical noun phrases. That's why it's called equi-noun phrase deletion, that transformation. But given the principle of compositionality, and given the way Montague works, by building up the meanings of constituents from the meanings of their subconstituents, and you build, there's nothing that could correspond to deleting a piece of a meaning of some part you had already put together. So if some part of that substructure should be Mary win, there should be something corresponding to the meaning of Mary win in the final sentence. So that was a problem. Recall the consequences of that rule of equi-noun phrase deletion that I mentioned earlier. The presumed deep structure, everyone was eager for everyone to win, would clearly give the wrong meaning to everyone was eager to win. So really, we don't want equi-noun phrase deletion. So the MGTG resolution that I suggested in my very first papers was that what we want as an underlying subject in the embedded sentence of everyone is eager to win or Mary is eager to win is a bindable variable, not a full noun phrase. I followed Montague's line and bound it by a lambda abstraction to give the complement be eager to win a verb phrase type. There's another way to do it, having a variable have a full sentence as the embedded thing, X win, and have it bound by lambda at a higher level. So I did it as in 7a. To win is the property of being an X such that X wins. That's a property type. Alternatively, you could apply everyone to the lambda abstract of X was eager for X to win and have variables on in both positions. That solution, or two almost equivalent solutions, is one illustration of the importance of the Fregean principle that wherever quantifiers may be involved, recursion has got to be allowed to work on open sentences with quantifiers getting into the structure, in a sense, at the level where they're going to take their scope. It was Montague's use of lambda abstraction as the active variable binding operator in his paper, Proper Treatment of Quantified Sentences in Ordinary English, that unified variable binding in connection with quantification, relative clauses, interrogatives, all sorts of things that involve variable binding. Lambda abstraction, I can't give a lecture on lambdas here, but what lambda abstraction does is it creates compositional names for functions. Any lambda expression denotes some kind of a function, and the stuff inside after the lambda part tells you what that function does to an input corresponding to the lambda bound variable. And this is central to function argument-centered type theory. In retrospect, what made the transformational rules that involved identical noun phrases break down when quantifiers were discovered was the practice that started from syntactic structure with its kernel sentences of doing all recursion on closed simple sentences. So when quantifiers were discovered, then in Chomskyan syntax, a corresponding change was eventually made, replacing that embedded identical NP with a special null element familiar to contemporary syntacticians, big pro. What is big pro? It's a bound variable. It's the bound variable that the semanticists said you've got to have in there. Other syntactic theories, including lexical functional grammar, head-driven phrase structure grammar, and modern categorical grammar, were developed later and were designed from the start not to run into those problems. And Polly Jacobson in her work has shown how you can capture these properties within a semantic that has no variables at all. It makes heavy use of combinators. You can see her work for that. It's really interesting. The height of initial interaction on semantics between linguists and philosophers had passed by 1980, followed by the rise of cognitive science, including semantics, and then by a specialization of semantics inside linguistics, with many individual scholars still maintaining links of various kinds within and across the disciplines. But formal semantics became like a sub-discipline of linguistics, rather than at its earlier stage where it all depended on close interaction with linguists and philosophers. By the middle of the 1980s, the recognition of formal semantics as part of the core curriculum in linguistics was seen in the publication of textbooks and the growing number of departments with more than one semanticist. Formal semantics spread and became mainstream semantics in the US and Europe in spite of Chomsky's skepticism. And MIT hired its first formal semanticist, my student Irena Heim, in 1989, and its second, Angelika Kratzer's student, Kai von Fintel, in 1994. So the UMass semanticists populated the MIT department, and MIT quickly became one of the leading programs in formal semantics as well as syntax. By the early 1990s, formal semantics, which was no longer called Montague grammar, although that's when the phrase Montague grammar made it into the Oxford English Dictionary, was a fully established field. And by the early 90s, students were not conscious that the core fields had not always been phonology, syntax, semantics, as they should be, right? Well, we have to worry about phonetics and pragmatics too, right? But at least phonology, syntax, and semantics. By the late 1990s, linguistic philosophy interaction was on the increase again and more sophisticated than ever, thanks in part to what was happening at MIT, because Bob Stalnick was there in the philosophy department and Irena Heim was there in the linguistics department. And the philosophy students of the Jason Stanley, Zoltan Sabo generation were getting a great training in formal semantics as well as philosophy of language. With the work of Irena Heim, Angelika Kratzer, Gennaro Chierchia, and others, there was also greater integration of formal semantics with Chomskyan syntax. And now much important work is at the syntax-semantics interface. I just want to stick in a few notes. I'm not really even saying anything, just giving some pointers on formal semantics and the syntax-semantics interface. It's a big topic. Historically, that's a pretty recent term. It didn't come from me. It came from the Heim-Kratzer-Kierkegaard generation, I think. So for Montague, as I said before, syntax is an algebra, semantics is an algebra, compositionality, i.e. syntax-semantics interface, is that there should be a homomorphism between them. Categorical grammar is interesting. It was earlier in a way. Ajurkiewicz was an early Polish logician, and then Curry and Lambeck developed in different directions. In categorical grammar, semantic function argument structure is encoded right in the names of the syntactic categories. So a verb phrase is represented as something that takes a noun phrase to make a sentence, etc. And compositionality is the automatic. You do function argument structure according to what the syntax tells you all the way up. Lewis, in fact, suggested incorporating some categorical grammar into transformational grammar by using a categorical grammar for the deep structure instead of a phrase structure grammar with just arbitrary syntactic names for the labels of the categories. There's various kinds of what one might call monostratal syntax, syntax without a distinction between a level of deep structure and a level of surface structure, without transformations. Generalized phrase structure grammar, then the later variant, head-driven phrase structure grammar, what Emmenbach called extended categorical grammar, Polly Jacobson's variable free grammar. Compositionality was central in all of those. Contemporary Chomskyan generative grammar generally has an interface via a separate syntactic level called LF, which sort of stands for logical form, but you're just supposed to think of it as syntax. Right? And there's been many recent advances in that direction. And for meta-level theory, the study of tectogrammatical versus phenogrammatical structure, I was not aware of that in the time when I was helping work on formal semantics. Dowdy was one of the first linguists to become aware of it. Muskins has done a lot of work to develop that directly. It's something comparable to deep structure and surface structure, but as a level of structure that can be applied to Montague grammar and all of these monostratal syntaxes as well. Before closing, I want to briefly mention one important foundational issue that has been with the field of formal semantics since linguistics first became part of its history. We know that the Chomskyan revolution in linguistics included putting human linguistic competence at the center of what we are studying. What's in the head of the speaker of a language and how it's acquired, that's what we're trying to find out. When some of us took on the challenge of combining Montague's approach to semantics with Chomsky's approach to syntax, technical and substantive progress was rapid and successful. All kinds of semantic problems were solved beautifully and semantics exploded. But there was still this lingering apparent incompatibility of Chomsky's view of linguistics as a branch of psychology and the anti-psychologistic Fregean tradition that Tarski and Montague worked in, viewing meanings as abstract objects, and David Lewis as well. David Lewis distinguished language from the speaker's knowledge of a language. Language is an abstract object. The object of psychological study is speaker's knowledge of a language. Chomsky always put the two together as a single thing. Montague and Lewis did not. In hindsight, what I once saw as a problem, I now see as a good thing, that tension. How semantics, when we worry about that problem, semantics pushes us toward a less narrow view of what linguistic competence should mean and what psychological reality should mean. The foundational problems arise particularly for lexical semantics, where there are issues that have no counterparts in syntactic competence. Because when linguists talk about linguistic competence in syntax, they don't say much about the lexicon. They don't believe they have to, because the lexicon is something finite, at worst can be memorized. Or if there's parts, then you build some more syntax for the parts and study them. In semantics, the recursive compositional rules for combining meanings, from a psychological and competence perspective, they're relatively unproblematic. Applying functions to arguments is a lot like putting syntactic expressions together by merge. You know, it's not a problematical issue. I mean, you can raise problems, but they won't be analogous to the lexical semantics problems. In semantics, on the other hand, some of the biggest worries have concerned the lexicon. It was on the basis of natural kind terms like tiger or water that Putnam argued in a famous paper in 1975 that meanings ain't in the head. Putnam argued, for instance, I'm just doing a tiny snapshot of this, for instance, that even though he could not tell, he knew nothing about how to tell a beech tree from an elm tree. But beech and elm were two words in his language. And the fact that he had no idea how to pick out a beech or an elm did not mean that both beech and elm just mean some kind of deciduous tree. No, in his language, beech picks out beech and elm picks out elms. Those are natural kinds. And his words in his language pick them out by virtue of him being part of a language community that has a certain history that includes a history of how those words were introduced. There are no problems comparable to that in syntax. Nobody thinks you have to know something about how words were introduced to know how those words work in your syntax. If you differ from somebody else, then you're speaking a different language in syntax. That's clear and not problematical. So Putnam said, so theory of meaning came to rest on two unchallenged assumptions. One, that knowing the meaning of a term is just a matter of being in a certain psychological state. That's the meanings in the head idea. And second, the thing that came from philosophy of language, that the meaning of a term in the sense of intention determines its extension, in the sense that two terms with the same intention are bound to have the same extension. And Putnam said, I shall argue that these two assumptions are not jointly satisfied by any notion, let alone any notion of meaning. So a resolution to the tension between Chomsky and psychologism and formal semantics came more recently from arguments by Stalnaker and Frege about the need to revise how we think about psychological realism. Stalnaker wrote a paper in 1989 arguing that meanings are in the head, but in what sense are they in the head? You know, I think Chomskyans tend to think of rules that are written inside in some language of internalized rules in the brain, right? But Stalnaker says, no, meanings are in the head more the way footprints are in the sand. What does it mean that there are footprints in the sand? Well, they're footprints by virtue of having a certain causal history of how they got there. That's what makes them footprints and not, say, creations by an artist or something. So Stalnaker said the apparent problem of the psychological reality came from taking too narrow a view of what it is to be in the head. Stalnaker wrote, a representational system is a system that's capable of being in a range of alternative internal states that tend to be causally dependent on the environment in a systematic way. That's what had been left out of this narrow view of in the head. Tyler Burge, 2010, argues that Chomsky's view of grammar in the mind underestimates the degree to which the natures of many mental states constitutively depend on relations to a subject matter that is beyond the individual who has those mental states. Stalnaker's and Burge's work suggests that we should combine work on individual semantic representations with much more research on how those representations can come to have the external relational content that makes reference and such things possible. If we insist on thinking of knowing a language in what Burge calls a hyper-intellectualized way, then an interpreted language, as Montague understood it, cannot be known by a human, cannot be in the head. In fact, I had argued that in some of my earlier papers, that given that meanings can't be in the head in that kind of sense, we don't know our language. And I said, that's okay, because language is underdetermined. and changes all the time. And it can change partly because it's underdetermined. Okay, but if we follow Frege in drawing insight from perception and how perception gives fallible, veridical knowledge prior to any kind of reasoning about the percepts, we can see semantics, including the difficult area of lexical semantics, as a particularly important and fruitful branch of psychology. Perception involves a relation between a perceiver and an external objective reality. Perception is normally veridical. It evolved to be veridical. It can be an error. Sure, there are optical illusions, etc. Reference and truth conditions involve a relation between a language user and external reality. Language is normally understood correctly. We get information from language, but the language user can be mistaken. Language, of course, goes beyond objective representation, and there are other deep problems surrounding lexical meanings. But that old puzzle of how to relate basic truth conditional semantics to semantic competence, as linguists want to understand it, is resolved, and cognitive science is the richer for it. So that's, and with that, I have a few references. If you have access to the handout, I think the organizers can make sure you have access to the handout. And I want to put up an acknowledgement slide at the end. More people than I can mention, but at least I wanted to mention some. And that's where I will stop. So
Thank you,
should I stop sharing? Should I stop sharing the screen?
It's up to you, but yeah, perhaps. And if somebody wants to, ask some question about the slides, you can share it again at the time, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you one more time. It was really exciting to hear the history of semantics. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any question, please send a message to Seunghun Lee. I just sent a message to everyone so you can find me. I'm one of the co-hosts. And just type your name and affiliation and send a message to me. And if you're okay with being recorded while you're asking question, please turn on your camera when you unmute yourself. That would be great. So the first question will be from Chris Tancredi at Keio University. Yeah.
Barbara, thank you for a very interesting talk and giving me a lot more to think about than I've been thinking about. I am particularly interested in the parts that you came up with at the very end of your talk. You were talking about the Stalnaker and Frege ideas of connecting language with perception. And I'm wondering how to do that best with a model theory. So one of the things about model theory is that it has a designated world in it that is taken to be the actual. And I'm wondering how it is that you characterize that and connect it with both with the notions of an internal kind of Chomskyan view of language and the philosopher's idea that somehow we're talking about an objective world. And let me just spell out a little bit what my worries. I've been thinking myself into confusion, and I'm hoping that you're going to be able to think me out of it. The problem stems from a kind of a skeptic problem. If you have a skeptical view about what the actual world is. So to make it as completely different from the real world that we think we live in as possible, imagine that the world actually doesn't contain any matter. It doesn't contain any dimensions. The only thing that the actual world contains is thought and 11 dimensions of time. And what we think of as the real world is somehow an interaction between multiple thoughts coming together at particular time coordinates. Okay, so then the actual world would really play no role whatsoever in our identification of concepts like, for example, the agent of a context. That would mean that whatever the designated world is in a model would be either the actual world and hence unrelated to anything that we communicate, or it would be something completely different from the actual world, in which case I'm wondering how you would coordinate that variable across speakers to be able to even communicate anything that involved reference to, for example, the agent of a context. So that's what I've been kind of puzzling over for the last couple of weeks. I'm hoping you might be able to give me something that would shed some light on that problem.
Well, I don't think I can help with the 11 dimensions of time. No, well, okay. So I was starting to be prepared to try to answer your question before you got into the skeptical part. See, yeah. So let me first say why I won't try to answer the skeptical part. I will let you ask real philosophers that question, because that's a deeply philosophical question. I think that even Quine eventually came around to the idea that a lot of our notions, I mean, he talked about indeterminacy of translation, and Chomsky was very down on that. And Quine later backed away a little bit from that, thinking about evolution. That is, our psychological properties evolved in the world that we evolved in. And we evolved in the actual world, right? And so perception, I mean, what Burge studied in perception in creatures of various degrees of complexity is how perception has clearly evolved to help the creature survive in the actual world that it's in. And that's why perception, I mean, that's why, in a sort of teleological sense, that's why perception is normally veridical. Although, of course, we know it isn't always veridical. And I think that Burge would probably say the same thing in saying it's very unlikely that the actual world is as you described it, because how did we evolve to think it was so different, right? Okay, so there, I mean, you could get into deep philosophical arguments about it, but I would say it's unlikely that the actual world is so radically different from what we think. Although, of course, you know, if it, even the fourth dimension that seems to be required by relativity theory wasn't part of our ordinary language evolution. You know, we had a notion of simultaneous as a two-place predicate, and we thought event one is simultaneous with event two. That's just a property of the two events. And then Einstein comes along and says, no, it's event one, event two, in a frame of reference. So there are things beyond what we imagine that maybe at any given time, there's a lot we don't know about the actual world. But for the ordinary macro size objects and things, you know, we get along pretty well perceptually because we evolved, our perceptual system evolved too. And it seems that our language of thought, whatever it's like, also was evolving in something like the actual world. Now, the thing I was going to say before you brought in the skeptical part was I was worried about possible worlds, you know, what to do with possible worlds, even if you leave out the actual world. I was worried what to do about possible worlds if we wanted to have things in our head, because I could convince myself very easily that there must be non-denumerably many distinct possible worlds. And you can't fit, I mean, our finite representations could represent denumerably many distinct things, but they can't represent non-denumerably many distinct things, but we can convince ourselves there are non-denumerably many distinct worlds. So in some of the very earliest papers I wrote in the 70s, you know, I wrote some that were sort of wrestling with what am I going to do about it? How do I get Montague grammar in our head, you know, right? Well, I said, well, and this is just me as an amateur armchair philosopher of psychology or something, saying, well, we must have to make do with partial representations of possible worlds. We don't have complete representations of any world, because there's too many things that vary in any given world. So we don't have a representation of one thing that is the actual world. We have some partial representation of some properties we think the actual world has, and then some kind of partial representations that have to do with ways that other worlds can vary. So we're constantly, I think, dealing with sets of possible worlds, equivalence classes that are equivalent with respect to the little bits of that we can represent. So that's the approach that I would take there. Because I mean, I would love to see much more work on this kind of thing. I kept asking my psychologist friends, you know, what's been done on the psychology of mathematics, of how we reason about real numbers, we reason about non-enumerable sets. What do you say about our knowledge of that kind of stuff? Is that all some paper and pencil knowledge that doesn't count as anything in our conceptual arsenals, or you know, or what? And I don't know yet. I haven't seen much on that kind of work, but we would need that too. But for the meantime, in the meantime, I think we deal with small finite representations. How I mean, people like Johnson Laird were developing mental models that had a kind of pictorial status to them, and that would be an interesting thing to play with, because a lot of our thinking is obviously pictorial. Jackendorf has worked some on that too. I mean, maybe there's ways to take Jackendorf's idea about conceptual structure and cast it in terms of making those things as some kind of representations of partial possible worlds or something.
Okay, let me just follow up really quickly, because the next question was, how do you distinguish the designated actual world from a belief world? Because if it's only a partial representation, then you have to ask, what is it that makes it that chosen?
I don't think we can't distinguish it qualitatively. I think the only thing we do is with indexicals. That's what indexicals do. It's when you say the word really or the word actually, you're pointing to the actual world. You don't know which one it is.
So
we don't know which one it is.
Indexicality essentially comes first, and the world is built on the indexicals. That's the
and that's, I mean, that would relate to Burge's idea that you've got to constantly be thinking about the relation to the external reality that you're how do you know you're perceiving ant number one rather than ant number two? Well, you don't, but you're perceiving some particular ant is responsible for the percept you're having, and it's the external world that tells you which ant that was.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, welcome. That was fun. Fun question.
Okay, thank you, Chris. The next question is from Shungo Fuji from University of Tokyo. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
So sorry, I don't have a question. I misunderstood what you said. So please turn next person. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh.
I'm sorry about that. Actually, we are still waiting for some questions to come in. Shigeto?
Well, I don't have a particular question myself, but if you feel shy about asking a question in English, I will try my best to translate your question into English. So feel free to ask it in Japanese if that makes you if that makes it easier for you to ask.
You're talking to them and not to me, right?
Yeah. But you can ask your question in Japanese.
I could ask it in Japanese, right?
You can say that in Japanese, perhaps.
日本語でお聞きしていただいてもできるだけこちらで、英語にするようにいたしますので、あと顔出しが恥ずかしい方も別に出す必要はありませんので。 せっかくの機会ですので、どうぞ。
Yeah, I would also say to people who are listening, you don't have to think up fancy questions like Chris Tancredi's questions. You can ask much simpler questions if you like, and I'd be very happy with that.
I guess while people are thinking, you know, oh, sorry. Right.
I'm thinking there's one question actually. Ken Nakatani, can you also say your affiliation?
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay. All right. Yeah, thank you for the talk. My name is Ken Nakatani from Konan University in Kobe. And I have a rather, naive, it's not really naive, but I have a question about what your take on the real-time comprehension of a sentence. So my question is about the relationship between the semantic computation as discussed in the field of semantics, and also the real-time computation of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the thing is that almost all the semantic theories are based on the principle of compositionality, and for that reason, the semantic computation should start from the bottom usually. But in real-time computation, the sentences don't go that way, and
Mm-hmm.
actually often it goes in the opposite way, starting from the left to right. But in English, and especially in Japanese, the right leftmost thing is on the top, right? So do you have any ideas about how you reconcile the relationship between the top-down understanding and the bottom-up computation?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. I haven't thought to talk about it in any of these talks that I've given, and I probably should, because because the way I describe compositionality, I describe it in a way that sounds very bottom up, because I talk about meaning of the whole as a function of the meaning of the parts. But in fact, it's not directional. In fact, it's not directional. So, I mean, it's analogous to phrase structure rules. If you think in syntax, S consists of NP and VP. You can treat that as a parsing rule, that if you have an NP and a VP, you can build it into an S, or you can treat it as a production rule, that if you have a S, you can expand it into an NP and a VP. And the same thing is true in semantics. One thing so in the very nice textbook that Irena Heim and Angelika Kratzer wrote, relatively early on, they take pains to get the students to realize that you can do semantic derivations working either top down or bottom up, because what you have with each rule is a kind of constraint on the relation between the meaning of the composed thing and the meanings of its two parts. And a nice way to illustrate this sort of in practice is to observe that the way kids learn new words, they will often hear a new word in a sentence, where the sentence gives them a lot of context to help determine what that word must be. Some of Susan Carey's famous experiments involve introducing a new color term, and she will say something like, "Bring me the chromium ball, not the red ball, but the chromium ball." And if kids have never heard the word chromium before, but they solve the equation, an equation that has one unknown in it. Because of compositionality. They use compositionality to work out what the meaning of that word must have been, given that they know the meanings of the other words and how they all were being put together. So in fact, one of the reasons that I have been inclined to like the monostratal syntactic theories with compositional semantics with them, rather than the transformational theories, was I didn't understand how to solve that problem with the transformational theory if you had to work through several layers of syntax to get to a logical form that you're going to interpret. But if you take something like a Montague grammar in its original form or a categorical grammar, Mark Steedman has shown this very clearly with categorical grammars, you can start with the first word. The first word, say it's a determiner. With the first word, syntactically, you know that's going to be part of a noun phrase, and you're looking for things to make the rest of a noun phrase. Semantically, you can interpret the meaning of that thing, and it's going to be looking for an argument, which is going to be the other part of the noun phrase. So you can start interpreting from the very first word. I mean, left versus right, that's a writing system, but I mean, we're always starting with the first word we hear, right? And we often are predicting what the later words are going to be. You know, we're working with the pieces we have. We're building up predictively, and I think all the computational linguists like this idea of the left corner parser that tries to predict what's coming higher while it sees what's coming successively. So compositionality is beautiful for that. Emmon Bach had a beautiful idea of putting even more things together: the syntax, the semantics, the syntax, the phonology, the morphology. He said, we're always generating a big n-tuple, you know, the n-tuple of the whole, its syntax, its semantics, its phonology, its morphology, is a function of the n-tuples of its parts. You know, and you start with the first thing you hear, and you're putting them all together with all of your linguistic knowledge at all of those levels. And that, I mean, that's a kind of a skeletal view. Then it takes a lot of serious work by people working on language processing to figure out how it really works. And also, as soon as you start thinking that way, you hit the problems of mismatches. You hit the problems where, you know, like if you say, he's late. Well, we think the main structure should be a subject and a predicate, but he's has a contraction of the verb glommed onto the subject, and just a piece of the verb phrase comes after. So the pieces it looks like you've got phonologically and morphologically don't look like the syntactic constituents they should be. So lots of people have been on the mismatch problems and how to get a theory that will handle them systematically. But the important thing is that compositionality is not inherently bottom-up. Inherently, it can be looked at as constraint-based, as a relation between the big parts and the lower parts. And you can work bottom-up, or you can work top-down, or you can start in the middle and work both ways. So yeah. So I love that question, because I know that the way I talk about it makes it sound bottom up, and that's misleading.
Okay, yeah, that's really suggestive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nakatani Sensei. Next question comes from Teruyuki Mizuno from University of Connecticut. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm a grad student from UConn. I'm also doing semantics. And as a student who is working on semantics, I sometimes wonder, so for instance, so formal semantics is a very young field, and it seems that there's no kind of grand theory like universal grammar like in syntax. So for instance, there are many theories in formal semantics like dynamic semantics, degree semantics, event semantics, and so on. But interests seem to be scattered. And so yes, compositionality is one kind of principle that unifies the studies formal semantics. But I feel that our interests seem to be kind of disperse, much more scattered than syntax. So do you think formal semantics needs a big picture like universal grammar, or do you think it is possible, or do you think it should be done in tandem with syntax or other fields? This is my question.
That's a hard question for me, because because I don't tend to be a grand theory person myself. That's sort of temperamental. Well, let me first question the premise, because when you say syntax has a grand theory, you sound a little bit parochial. I mean, some Chomskyan syntacticians may believe there is one grand theory, but there are, and I think, well, okay, so this might be controversial, but I would say that one thing about semanticists is we all talk to each other pretty congenially. And I think that's not always so true in syntax. So I think syntacticians tend to be a little more, you know, they stick to one camp, so to speak. So I mean, there's some of that in semantics. Barwise and Perry were trying to build up situation semantics like a, you know, like a kind of a separate empire for a while. But really what happened was Angelika Kratzer took ideas from situation semantics, developed them, I think, better, because Barwise and Perry never accepted modal notions, and they didn't want possible worlds in their theory. So Kratzer took situations as parts of possible worlds and could do beautiful things with it. So I think most of the favorite things that I know of in the different theories, I can find ways to put them together. I don't see it as fragmented. I see it more as some people are working on certain parts that they're more interested in. And I think of it as analogous to, this is probably a bad analogy, but sometimes I think it was analogous to airplane design. That some kinds of engineers will work on the fuselage and the wings and the stresses and making sure the wings won't fall off. Somebody else has got to work on all of the instrumentation that's going to go into the things that you see in the cockpit, or used to in the old days. I guess nobody sees them anymore. And you couldn't find a piece of paper big enough to draw all of those dimensions in one picture, but you got to make sure that they're all compatible, or the plane won't fly. Now, I'm sorry, it's a kind of stupid analogy, but I think for semantics, different people work on different specializations. And when you see somebody working on tense and aspect, you might not hear them talk very much about the quantifiers. But in principle, if people are talking to each other, we can make the parts fit together when we need to. And I don't know. I don't know. I mean, Montague certainly had a grand theory, but I think people found it. Well, he had a grand theory about some basic aspects of architecture. Although it was interesting that he said within that architecture, meanings could be whatever you wanted to take as meanings, as long as you could make the right kind of algebra and do your compositionality. And similarly for syntax. But most people found his syntax a little too constrained, a little too simple. So things have been added, but I think that a lot of work is going on at the syntax semantics interface, and it's driven more by people who work the way Irena and Angelika and Gennaro work than the way I used to work, where I was sticking a little closer to Montague's own ideas. So they're finding ways to make it all compatible with Chomsky syntax. So it's, yeah. I guess I'm finding various ways of not answering your question while still being happy about the state of semantics.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Next question comes from Sumio Nishiguchi-sensei from Otaru University of Commerce.
Yeah, sorry, I texted to everyone. It was just a mistake. Well, my question is simple. I'm just curious, Barbara, what made you write a book about history? What was the motivation?
Oh, that's a good question, because I'm finding it really difficult to do. I don't write books. I write things that have deadlines, and the problem with the book is it doesn't have a deadline. It's taking me forever. But I can tell you how I got started. I had for a book of my selected papers, they wanted a new introduction, and I didn't know what to do. And I finally decided, okay, let me put a little semi-autobiographical piece of reflections of a formal semanticist. And I talked about my development and the development of the field kind of together. And then I got an invitation to give a talk in Oslo. I was going to be giving a talk on something that had to do with some semantic constructions in Russian that I was working on with my husband and some Russian colleagues. But I got an invitation to give another talk beforehand for philosophers and linguists about the history of formal semantics. So I gave a talk. I designed a talk, and I had a lot of fun doing that. And that was followed by an invitation to a little mini conference for Rich Thomason's 70th birthday. And I wanted to go, but I didn't have anything new to say. But then I said, but if I could reflect a little bit on the history, but do it in a way that recognizes the fact that the people at this conference are all part of that history, and I'll just kind of go through some interesting timelines and things. If I could do that, I'll come. And they said, sure. So I did that, and that was fun. And at the party afterwards, my friend Barbara Abbott said, Barbara, you should write a book. And suddenly I thought, oh, well, yeah, because I lived through all of that period. And I came from, Chomsky was my dissertation advisor. And then my first job was at UCLA, and that's where, and I've known David Lewis since he was an undergrad. We were undergraduates together at Swarthmore, and he was at Harvard while I was at MIT, and he came to UCLA just 1 year after I did. And he's the one who told me, oh, my colleague Richard Montague is doing some stuff you might find interesting. So I had really lived through that stuff from the beginning, and I was the one in a position to start trying to put those together. So I thought, yeah, I should write a book. So I signed I wrote up a proposal. I sent it to Oxford. They sent me a contract, and that was 2010. And they put in the contract that it should be finished in 2015. And I said to my editor, I said, I hope you're very good at author psychology, because I have great trouble writing things that don't have a deadline, and something as big as a book with a deadline 5 years away, that's going to be hard for me. And he made a very stupid mistake. He said, oh, that deadline doesn't really mean anything. And so I'm still working on it. It's 10 years later, and it's a problem. Life is finite, so I've got to finish it.
It's not infinite.
But it's fun. It's fun. So for those 10 years, basically, I have said no to all invitations that wouldn't be for talks or papers that could push this project further. So Festrifts, in papers for people's Festrifts, or for things that are about the history in one way or another, and that's been fun. So I've got lots and lots of pieces, but so far it doesn't look compositional to get those pieces to make a book. But somehow I'm going to make it happen.
Oh, it was great. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And I also want to add that I introduced you as a grandmother of formal semantics to my students.
Oh, that's sweet. That's nice.
Sorry. I don't know if it's fun.
Yeah, I like that. Real life, I'm a great grandmother already, but well, actually, when I look at the family tree of students, I do have, since academic generations are so short, I've got some paths that go down 4 or 5 links. Some I'm not sure. I don't even know all of them anymore.
Thank you.
That's
I don't
fun.
want to dominate the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nishiguchi-sensei. Next question comes from Gabe Oppenheimer at UMass.
Oh. Hi, Gabe.
I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to possible acquisition paths for any semantics, or any research that's gone on for semantics and acquisition in general. I know it's very broad.
Yep. Thanks. So I have to introduce you to the rest of the crowd. Gabe is one of our undergraduates at UMass, and he comes to our picnics. Oh, this fall, I guess we can't have a picnic. We can't have a live picnic anymore. So yeah, okay, so there is a lot of work by now on acquisition of semantics, and what so formal semantics has given some ideas. I wouldn't say there's a lot of very direct connections yet between ways that formal semanticists have worked and things that are done in acquisition. But I remember one idea I put out once. It hasn't, I don't know how many, I don't know if it's been picked up very much, but it occurred to me that when you look at function argument structure as being central to how meanings get composed, you know, that the simple intransitive verbs are one-place predicates, and a simple proper name subject is an entity that it can apply to, or an adjective is a function that can apply to a noun, etc. I thought, well, okay, so what's going on at the one-word stage is kids learn a lot of names of kinds of things, and they also pick up a lot of names of simple actions, and you know, sort of visible sorts of verbs that have kind of visible actions in their meanings, or you know, or some predicate. When a kid has a one word hot, you don't even know whether it's a noun that means hot thing or an adjective that means hot as a property. But you see these one word things. But then the two word stage, I thought maybe that's when they just are starting to apply some functions to some arguments. Although I know when I talked about that once in a public setting, another linguist, Elizabeth Bates, said no, she thought that what was going on in the two-word stage is not function applied to argument, but topic and comment, something at the discourse structure level. So that those both have to be looked at. But then the idea is, okay, but whatever's going on in the simple one word and two word, then compositionality gives you this notion of recursion of the bigger semantic units going with the bigger syntactic units. And what takes off is when they realize they can nest these operations one in another. That in the type theory, we see functions that can take other functions as their arguments, or the function can take as its argument something that was the output of an earlier function argument combination. So that's one kind of thing. Then there's a lot of work. Oh, there is a lot of work that relates to the tense and aspect on completed telic and atelic predicates, completed actions and ongoing actions, and finding ways of when kids are making those distinctions. And there's been lots of work on quantifiers. It's really interesting in these sentences like every boy is riding a horse. They will say no to a picture in which indeed every boy is riding a horse, but there are some horses that don't have any boy riding on them. So they don't want just that for every boy there's a horse. They want also for every horse there's a boy. And so trying to figure out what they're thinking that leads them to those interesting.
Every boy riding every horse.
Well, what?
Their reading is every boy riding every horse.
Well, no. To me, that would have to have. That sounds impossible. I mean, it's almost as if it's a conjunction of every boy is riding a horse and every horse is ridden by a boy. But it's so it's there isn't. I mean, there isn't a natural English sentence, I don't think, right, that would exactly say this all and only kind of relation.
There wouldn't be.
But it's they want. So it's a fascinating problem. It's been worked on for a long time. If I took my time, I could think of more examples, but it's a great topic. Tom Roper's students, I mean, a lot of students have been working. There's Gennaro is in league with some Italian acquisition specialists. So there's been work by some of his students on acquisition. It's fun. Acquisition is fun, and formal semantics is fun. So how could it not be fun?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have multiple people who want to ask questions, so we'll continue. We'll probably pass some time, even though we said it will be until 11. So next is from Toshi Ogiharu from University of Washington.
Toshi.
Excuse me. Hi.
Hi. Where
Hi.
are you?
Hi.
I don't see
Toshi
you.
Ogiharu from University of Washington.
Turn on your. Oh, you don't want to turn on your video?
Let's see. Is it on?
You don't have to, but I'd be happy to see.
I hope it's. I think it's okay. Do you have any thoughts on the cross linguistic semantics? I tend to work on Japanese and English, and I tend to kind of focus on differences rather than similarities. Although I'm obviously interested in the universals, so I sometimes wonder if the differences could come from ontological differences in different languages, or it's just a matter of syntax semantics mapping relations. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. So I've thought about those issues. I don't have answers, but I think they're interesting. I've been surprised to discover that some of my colleagues in semantics take a very strong universalist position as a kind of starting. Think that we all have the same universal semantics that innately, and then it will just be a matter of what gets mapped to what, and I was surprised because I don't see any reason to start by assuming that until you've done some explorations to try to see if it's the case. So one of the earliest big projects in cross-linguistic semantics was a project that Emmen Bach and Angelika Kratzer and Eloise Jelinek and I carried out on cross-linguistic quantification. And we started by thinking about the question of whether all languages have generalized quantifiers. Now that's a logically high type, sets of entities, but it was a concept that Montague used and found really valuable to be able to unify English noun phrases and to reply to Russell and to show that English is not illogical in putting John, the man, and every man into the same syntactic category. I mean, Russell and his friends thought that was one of the things that made English look unruly. But generalized quantifier theory says, no, that's beautiful. That's this very rich category of the meanings of possible noun phrases. But given that it's a pretty high logical type, we thought, well, it's reasonable to ask, do all languages have generalized quantifiers as their noun phrase meanings? And Eloise joined the project after Emmen and Angelika and I had talked about it at an LSA meeting and talked about what we were looking for. And she came up to us and said, well, tell me more about how I would find out if the language I work on has generalized quantifiers, because I suspect that it might not. She was working on Straight Salish, same family of languages that Lisa Matthewson and her colleagues have done so much work on recently. And she did a whole summer of field work and concluded that Straight Salish does not have generalized quantifiers. And she looked at the kind of structures they use to express the things that English can express with generalized quantifiers. And from that work, and then a few other people found languages that seem not to use generalized quantifiers. And it looks as though what might be more nearly universal is the kind of adverbial quantification that English also has. When you say a quadratic equation always has two roots. I mean, I use that example because it shows that always there is not quantifying over time. That's just an ordinary quantifier in that one. And so with those adverbial quantifiers, then the mapping between syntax and semantics works a little bit differently, but you can get to the same kinds of meanings. So my inclination is to look for diversity and then try to see try to see if you do find constraints and do find some universals. So there's lots of, so by now, that besides lots of cross-linguistic work on quantification, there's by now, as you know perfectly well, lots of, maybe the richest area is in tense and aspect. So there's lots and lots of cross-linguistic work and lots of field work in the tense and aspect area. You're one of the pioneers in that, and that's great. And there's some other areas. Let's see. Well, yeah, adjectives. Adjectives are interesting, and even the category of adjective doesn't seem to be quite universal. And I don't know so much of that work, but that's a really fascinating area. If not all languages distinguish between adjectives and verbs, say, and have a kind of common predicate category, is there within that category still some interesting things that separate out the adjective-like ones, so to speak? This is a little bit like what happened when people said not all languages distinguish mass from count. And that was claimed about Chinese, for instance. And then other linguists came and said, oh yeah, it may look like they're not distinguishing, but when we look in more fine-grained way, we can find properties that separate the mass-like ones from the count-like ones. So it's a great area. I mean, I'm really glad that there's so much field work now. That's in the first iteration of this talk, I didn't have that part about the problems with the meanings in the head at the end, and I had some little tiny words about various areas, including field work and typology and that kind of thing. Because as somebody else said when they started their question, formal semantics is a young field, and so we're not as far advanced in things like typology and acquisition and things as some other fields, but they're expanding in leaps and bounds, and that's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ogiara Sensei. Next question is from Joe Tabard at Tokyo University of Electrocommunication. Please unmute yourself and show your video. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Hi. My question is kind of big and open-ended, so it might not be good for this time. So you spent a lot of time talking about how the syntax and semantics are bridged in the history of that. But I had a different question about if you see any sort of orderly way for it to bridge semantics and the more heavily pragmatic aspects of language use, like reference. Just to give a general idea of what I'm talking about, like I'm sure it's a common topic, but like if you say, oh, the man who ate a cheeseburger came today, and the person who hears that knows that the man didn't eat a cheeseburger, but he knows that the person is talking about a man who ate, I don't know, a chicken burger or a hamburger or something else, right? So the compositional meaning of the man who ate a cheeseburger doesn't actually refer to anything, but it succeeds in referring to someone nevertheless. And so, you know, we have the pragmatic act, and then we have the semantic act, and I've been wondering about how you could sort of bridge those two things, or if there is a way to bridge them.
Great. Yeah, great. No, yes. So I think for me, the first seminal work was the paper by Keith Donnellan on reference. What's it called? Is it called Reference Indefinite Descriptions? But it started out by worrying about the sentence, the murderer is insane. Yeah, I think that was the example. And it was two people in the courtroom talking about a person who's there in the courtroom. And so one is referring to that guy as the murderer, but maybe he wasn't. Well, two different situations. That's right, two different situations. One is look in the courtroom, looking at this guy, already being convinced that he's the murderer from what you've heard in the court, but he's acting all weird. And so you're saying the murderer is insane, meaning that guy is insane, right? That's where it's the pragmatic reference. And the other is the situation where you haven't found the murderer yet, but you're just looking at the clues around the murder scene, and you conclude the murderer is insane. Basically whoever committed this murder is insane. So that's that would be the semantic, using the semantic content attributively. And in the other case, you're just using that content to help your hearer pick out who you mean to be referring to, right? And yeah, and he had other examples like the man drinking a martini. That's like your man eating the cheeseburger. And then Kripke wrote an article arguing with him that no, you could do that all. You could do that all with straight semantics. I don't remember now the details of his argument, but I remember I didn't like it, and I'm failing to recollect the content of my objections to Kripke's objections to Dunnellon. But a lot of Montague actually did important steps in bridging that as well. He wrote a paper called Formals of Pragmatics and a paper called Pragmatics and Intentional Logic. Now, he didn't look at those examples, but he looked at sentences with overt demonstrative determiners. And in the case where you have an overt demonstrative determiner, typically like that cheeseburger was on the floor a minute ago, and maybe it wasn't a cheeseburger. So in those cases, it's the determiner that's doing the referential work. And that's, for a lot of cases, you can get a good story out of seeing the determiners as doing the referential work. And for that, you should take the definite article the as potentially being ambiguous between being used with referential force versus being used with its Russellian kind of the one and only one such and such, kind of meaning. I mean, there's a little bit, I didn't get into that, but there are hints of some of that in my type shifting work where I talked about a definite description, sometimes just being of type E, like a name. It's just picking out an entity. And sometimes being this generalized quantifier that packs in the whole Russellian meaning. So I think that part of the problem of bridging pragmatics and semantics, a lot of it has to do with theories of indexicality and demonstratives. And in fact, with that also comes close to another interesting area that has pragmatic semantic problems. It's the problem of the perspectival words like that cookie tastes good, that cookie is tasty, and somebody else says, no, it's not. And then you try to decide, are they really arguing? Or are they just each expressing something about their own tastes? Right? So some implicit from my perspective may come into a lot of examples, and that's another pragmatic semantic bridge. So the main distinction, the big distinction between pragmatics and semantics classically, although the distinction is broken down when we see how completely intertwined they are, is pragmatics takes into account the language user. And semantics classically was just about the relation between expressions and the things they refer to. This was the old Morris and Peirce, ideas about semiotics. That syntax just looks at expressions and their relation to other expressions. Semantics is expressions and their relation to the external world, the reference and time, etc. And pragmatics is brings in the relation to the user. Well, pretty early on, I used to think you could keep the pragmatics kind of as a separate layer, and where you had things that would need some pragmatic filling in, you would just have a free variable in the syntax. So like for pronouns, you could just treat pronouns as free variables, and then like if you ask who is he, that kind of demonstrative use of he, well, just put in a free variable, and then the context should give you some connection of that variable to something that the user had in mind. But then it quickly became clear you can't just isolate pragmatics like that, because it plays a role in all kinds of recursive building up of the parts into the whole. So you have to take into account of context dependent expressions, you know, all throughout. So yeah, so the part of pragmatics that relates to context dependence is best approached the way we have approached every time we need to enrich meanings. Their meanings are functions from such and such to a referent. So it's like functions from possible worlds to reference. That's for the intentional stuff. Functions from a possible context to a reference. You know, that's for things that are depending on aspects of the context, including addressee, user, intended referent, and lots of stuff. David Lewis has a beautiful paper called Scorekeeping in the Language Game. And he says, you know, we constantly have to keep track of what's the most recently mentioned object, where is the hearer, you know, where all these different aspects. And yeah, so that's not all of pragmatics. There's other aspects of pragmatics are if I say, can you pass the salt, to know that it's not a question about your ability, it's a request for the salt. That's a farther remove. These other things that have to do with connecting reference to the context, in a way that's easier to formalize, you know, because we can see these aspects of context are helping to determine the meaning. But the determining the intention behind a question, or, you know, what somebody what are you getting at? You know, that's a question about the pragmatics. I may have understood your sentence literally, but I don't know what you're after, right? That's another layer of pragmatics, and that I don't have any interesting theoretical things to say about.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We still have a few more questions, so I think it's a rare opportunity, so we will go on a little bit. For those who have other things to do or have to leave, feel free to leave. And the next question will come from Minato Asari sensei from Tokyo Metropolitan University. Yeah.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm a graduate student studying philosophy, so I'm not so good at speaking English, but let me try. Thank you for great talk for Partee. My question is concerned with your last part. I'm a little bit surprised and pleased to know that you have such a philosophical tendency, but I have a question: the relationship between your last part and the recent development of machine learning and natural language processing, because you know, in the field of machine learning and recent natural language processing, the meaning of a word is considered as a word which are used in the same contexts or in the similar contexts, right? So I thought I was wondering if it was possible to consider our mental representation in other way than you, because you know, in recent machine learning they represent the meaning of a word such a cluster of words. So as far as semanticists wants to treat linguistic knowledge, you know, it may be possible to consider our mental representation of words as a such a in such a way. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Like a vector.
So, yes, so like a vector. So I thought I would like to know your opinion about it.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a fascinating question. Let me preamble by saying that I didn't discover linguistics until very near the end of my undergraduate work. I started out thinking I was going to major either in mathematics or Russian, and I didn't know which. And then because I loved languages and math, and then I discovered that all of the language majors, at least in the school where I was, went on to study literature. And I didn't think of, and I realized I couldn't major in Russian grammar. They didn't have that idea, though some places do, but that's bigger university. And by the end of my sophomore year, I wanted to go into the honors program, and you were supposed to have a major and 2 related minors. And I went to the head of the math department, and I said, is it possible that I could major in mathematics and minor in Russian and philosophy? I said, I don't see any relation among those 3 things. Those are just the 3 things I love best. And he scratched his head and he said, oh, I think I've heard of something called machine translation or mathematical linguistics or something like that. And Russian would be very useful because Sputnik had just gone up. And there weren't enough English speakers who knew Russian, so getting a machine to translate Russian would be good. And he said the philosophy seminars you want to do are logic and philosophy of science. Well, that's good for computers. So he helped me invent a fiction to justify what I wanted to study. And then one thing led to another, and I began hearing the word linguistics more and found my way into MIT the year they first started their program. And in fact, I was so naive. I went to see Chomsky the fall before to talk to him to see what it'd be like. And I said to him, well, I'm a math major and I've been interested in Russian and philosophy. And I understand there's this new field of machine translation or mathematical linguistics, and that you do that and you're going to have a graduate program. And he was so patient and gentle with me. Instead of saying, young lady, you have not done your homework very well before coming to talk to me. No, not a word of that. He just very patiently explained the difference between machine translation and mathematical linguistics, and why he was a little skeptical about one and believed the other one was a branch of psychology. I mean, my mind was just exploding. It was very. But then he said, we're going to have both in the first year program. You can take both and see what you like. And I did take both, and luckily I fell in love with the right side of it. But I enjoyed the machine translation part too, and I tried to write a little program. My assignment, I wrote a little program translating a subset of first order logic into English. It was hard enough. Negation was too hard. I had to leave that out. But anyway, but that's just why I've always been interested in philosophy, and my position is professor of linguistics and philosophy, and I've always liked that. So when Terry Parsons was here, we taught joint seminars all the time. We had students from both departments. After he left, I discovered it was harder to maintain the link without a partner in the philosophy department. But my interests never completely went away. I got kind of out of touch. That's why people had to tell me later about what Stolniker and Tyler Burge had been doing, and I had to, then I started catching up on it just recently. But anyhow, okay. So I have heard about the kind of work going on in machine learning where word meanings are represented in ways that really correspond to their co-occurrences with other words. And you make a vector that represents all of that, and that will represent similarity of meaning in terms of similarity of linguistic distribution. Now, that's an interesting idea, but there's obviously some things it doesn't get. So go back to Putnam and his problem with the beech and the elm. 2 kinds of deciduous trees similar in quite a lot of respects. Even their leaves look somewhat similar, although I don't think Putnam knew it. Both of them kind of on the periphery of many people's consciousness. I don't know what proportion of Americans can identify a beech or an elm, but clearly the words would have, I expect the words would have very similar distribution, except for the fact that there's something called Dutch elm disease, and there's no phrase like that for beeches. And there's a few other things, like beeches have nuts that are called beech nuts. So there'd be some differences, but in lots and lots of things that are going to occur very similarly. Nothing in that distributional representation is going to answer Putnam's problem. That beeches and elms are two distinct natural kinds, and what kinds they are is not settled by things in the distribution of the words in their in occurrences in writing. And so I don't know how these things are going to be gotten together. I think there are aspects of meaning that the distributional meaning people are just not trying to capture. It's not part of their job. And they can do language understanding tasks and data mining and things very well with what they have. This reminds me of another dimension. I remember I gave a little talk at a round table when MIT was celebrating its 150th anniversary, and you know we were having 5-minute or 10-minute introductions to top subjects, you know, that have been great developments coming out of MIT work by MIT people and stuff. And I gave a 10-minute little thing about formal semantics and the great things it has achieved. And then near the end, I said, there's been all kinds of progress in formal semantics, but I do not myself see how any of our work would ever be useful to a company like Google. You know, because we have, in all our traditional work, we're working by hand, right? We're figuring out, you know, what the entailments really are, and what kind of formulas with the lambdas here and there will get those entailments exactly right. And we don't believe, I mean, I don't for a minute believe that human language processing is got a lot of lambda conversions in it. I mean, it's got to be something different from that. And I don't believe that, I mean, Google does beautifully at what it does. It's not going to want to mess around with our formulas. But then it turned out that Peter Norvig was at that conference. He was chief of research at Google at the time, and he gave a couple of nice talks at other symposia in the same week. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, but we are starting to hire formal semanticists because you do negation better than we do. Now, it's true that in the last couple of years, I've heard some deep learning people from Stanford talking about how they're starting to be able to do conjunction and negation and stuff with their statistical methods and even get the logic to come out right. I don't know how they do it, but if they can also do that, then who knows where these things are going to go. One person who works in both of these worlds is Louise McNally in Barcelona. And she has a colleague, Gemma Boleda, who I think also bridges those worlds. So there are people working on, in the annual review of linguistics, there was an article not too long ago, I think it was by Alessandro Lenci, about formal semantics and statistical approaches to semantics. You know, so there are a few people who are trying to bridge those worlds, which look so different, you know, in their basic methodologies. But they're both fascinating developments. And I mean, my approach, my big motivating force in life has been, if two things look really really good, but I don't see how they're compatible. Well, there's a job for me to do. Try to figure out how to get them together. That was my Chomsky-Montague reaction. I went to UCLA as a Chomsky disciple, absolutely. I found what Montague was doing and got incredibly excited. They seemed incompatible, but I asked my department. Well, my department had happily let me teach a first quarter course on Montague grammar. It was the year after Montague had been murdered, and so I did 1 quarter course, and then all of us had to work so hard to understand the basics. We were just getting ready to want to try another quarter course in which we might try to extend it a little bit, see if we could add relative clauses, add something. And I went to my department head. I said, could I possibly do a 2nd quarter of Montague grammar instead of the course I was supposed to do on mathematical linguistics, theories of context-free grammar and all that stuff. And he was a nice gentleman, and he said, well, I said, most of the students who want to do it are students who would have been in the mathematical linguistics course, but they would like to do another Montague grammar. So he said, well, you all seem very enthusiastic, and it seems very interesting. Okay, but when are you going to get back to doing linguistics? Well, I think that question that he asked me on that day, that gave me something I hadn't really had before, and that was like a mission, a program, something I've got to do. Because before that, I would see an interesting topic, I write a little paper, and another interesting topic, I write a little paper. But there was something to do. I mean, these two things, they're both so good. There's got to be a way to get them together. So this Montague grammar should be linguistics. That was my goal. So your generation can take things like this distributional semantics and the formal semantics and say, these are both exciting things. How are we going to get them together? I'm too old to take that one on. That's for you guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a nice discussion. We have 2 more questions. So the next question is from Takanobu Nakamura from University of Edinburgh.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, I cannot speak loudly because it's 3:30 a.m. here. So my question is quite simple and naive, but this is a question about psychological reality of type shifting. So it's really nice to know that you like your paper on like type shifting. And I'm doing syntax and semantics, and I first kind of skeptical. I don't like the idea of type shifting because it's not very straightforward to find some structural or like, it's not like combinatorial convolutional rule. But I now do believe that we need some kind of type shifting. It's quite useful to see some like semantic flexibility of noun denotation and article-less languages, or like, the gap in determiners makes like type shifting available, something like that. But if you have some thought on like in a Chomskyan sense or in Frege sense, if you can make sense of this type shifting or something somehow encoded in the brain, I'd like to hear.
That's interesting. I have not thought about that question before. I mean, I've thought about psychological reality in a general sense, in the kind of things I've talked about. There's in that paper of mine, there's an open question that I still wish somebody would answer, because one of the things that I suggested, because in that paper I didn't make any very strong claims about which of these type shifting principles are real, or which ones might be universal, or which ones are language specific. I mean, I raised that issue here and there, but I was kind of laying out a palette for painters to take and use what's useful. But I did at some point suggest that I thought there was a general processing strategy of try to do things with the simplest types first. If something like a noun phrase could have a type E meaning, you try doing it as a type E noun phrase first, and you try to do everything in the simplest types that it can be in, and only shift things to higher types when you're pushed to by coercion, like this thing won't combine with this predicate unless you shift one of them. But then I got worried about whether try simplest types first could be a good strategy, because it sounds like a dangerous strategy if it sounds like it might depend on where you start. If you started with simplest types for the initial words in the phrase versus, say, if you had started with the simplest types for the later words in a phrase, would you reach the same conclusion? Is there a unique kind of simplest types first strategy? Would it get you to a simplest result? What constraints would the grammar have to have, or the whole system have to have, in order to have a unique solution for every case of trying simplest types first? And I put that out there. I forget, somebody recently alluded to that question as something that indeed needed some work. I can't remember who that was, but I haven't actually seen any work on it. And there would need to be, because I think I think there are some natural principles. There are clearly some natural simplest types. We don't know if we've got the types right, you know. Even the idea that it's all function argument is just a hypothesis, because when you look at people who do unification grammar and glue semantics, the structures are much flatter, and you're not trying to do everything with function argument. So my whole type structure thing was built on a function argument base. And if that's wrong, then you should be looking in some different directions anyway. But trying to look for principles that would help tell you, you know, what is the right direction to go. But if you can have some hypotheses about what the simplest types are, if we're anywhere near correct on what the basic types of the language are, then it's sort of clear what the simplest types are, if they're the basic types. And then if we know some basic combinatorial principles, you know, there's some natural directions to look for some universal processing of what kinds of principles to try for natural coercion. Is that, I mean, it's a little vague, but does that help?
I think that helps, but I have some follow-up additional naive question, if I'm allowed to do in this time, but I'm kind of skeptical, or like I'm also doesn't like really the notion of type shifting as last result or coercion or kind of repair strategy. Sounds like, I'd say it's, I don't know, it's like syntax sends something if this interface things are right, and then semantics know what kind of input they want to get, but they can fix some kind of mismatch by themselves without resorting to the structure. You know, it's quite naive. I don't know how to express it, but I feel like if that kind of repair is allowed,
I know.
then
So I don't. So this is a good question to work on, and it's another one that I think is going to be the younger generations. So I was taken by surprise when I saw the proliferation of functional categories, because if you've got functional categories all over the place, then that makes the semantics much more determinate. But most of those functional categories are invisible. So how do you know they're there? I mean, that's sort of the other side of the question. So I started out thinking of, you know, nominalization is a process that turns a sentence into a noun phrase, you know, rather than being triggered by a certain functional category that puts a thing there that has its own specific semantics to make it into a noun phrase. So I don't know how, so I'm skeptical of the proliferation of functional categories, and the type shifting is a way that helped me stay close to syntax. And I know that Irene and Angelica are probably skeptical on the other side, and I don't. And so you guys, you know, my great grand students, you know, you've got to work on that and find some, see if you can find some empirical arguments. If you can't find some empirical arguments, then you've just got to keep going and looking for what's the best theory. And you know, and it's going to be, it's not, these questions are not answered in a simple way. And one thing, if I can just put a side note that's not directly related to your question at all about working and you know, how to work and try to resolve what's the best theory. One theory that doesn't get nearly enough attention is Polly Jacobson's variable free semantics. And I think it's simply because she's not at a place like MIT or Edinburgh or you know, I mean, she's at Brown University, which is small. She has small number of students. She's done a huge amount herself, but no one person working single-handedly can work out all of the proliferations and applications of their theory and all the responses to all the other arguments as somebody with a big team can. So sometimes one side wins just because there's more people working in it. And that's sort of not fair in a way. You know, when people ask, why did generative semanticists lose the war and yet so many of their ideas came back in a different form later? I think the answers are more sociological than intellectual. You know, and that happens sometimes. So yeah, so it's so try to keep an open mind about all the, it's good to be skeptical. I mean, I've alternated in my own work between periods when I'm looking open-mindedly at lots of different approaches and saying, yeah, but I want to work on specific problems, so I've got to fix some theoretical things to be able to actually work on something. So there's other periods when I get inside a theory and work narrowly, but I don't want to ever feel like I've become totally blinded to looking at other kinds of ways of looking at stuff. So you all have a lot of work to do ahead. You know, there's lots of great questions to work on.
So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. We have one more question, and after that we'll wrap up. And if you still have question after that, maybe Barbara agreed to stay a few more minutes after that. So after the wrap up, you can ask another question. But first, the last question will come from Junri Shimada, Keio University.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Yes. Yes, I'm staring at your name. Okay, Junri. Okay.
Okay. So my name is Junri. Thank you for your great talk. So my question is this. So the basic idea that Montague established is that syntactic structures are mapped into meanings, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about interpreting language. But when it comes to
what? When you think about what?
When it comes to language production, I think it makes more sense to think about a reverse mapping of some sort, because you start with a meaning and then you want to somehow express that in language. So for instance, like when you write a mathematical proof, you just think without language, and then after your thought is done, then you somehow translate that into, Japanese or English or whatever language you have. So I think you can think without language, but it seems like the linguistic theories or semantic theories don't really address this point, I think. And so I wonder what you think about this one.
So, okay, so I think there's two different issues, and those are fascinating questions, and there's two different issues there. Let me for a moment leave out the part about thinking without language and just address the directionality issue, interpretation versus production. The fact that in Montague grammar there's a homomorphism from the syntactic object, from the syntactic algebra to the semantic algebra, does not actually create any asymmetry between production and interpretation, because it's a relation. The mapping is a relation, and the relation holds between these two structures. So you can look at that relation in either direction, in principle. In practice, in practice, it's harder if you go all the way into the model theoretic interpretation, because the interpretation of a proposition is a set of possible worlds. And if you just look at the set of possible worlds, you've lost all the structure that corresponded to things like noun phrases and verb phrases. You've just got a set of possible worlds. But if you take David Lewis's idea of thinking of meanings in terms of structured meanings, where the meaning is a structured object that has all of the syntactic structure that was underlying it, with each node associated with a meaning at that node, then you've got the meanings of the whole and of all the parts without throwing anything away. And in that case, you could much more readily think about mapping between the syntactic object and the semantic object in either direction. It's hard to try to say this just in words, but in principle, the directionality problem is potentially not so bad. Now, the other part of your question that says maybe your thought began with no words at all, and then you work on getting into words. That's a problem that is bigger than the problem of mapping between syntax and semantics. That's a problem of mapping between non-language and language. And how we do that, I don't know. I mean, some people think more in words than others. I've been able to discover that sometimes I'm thinking in words because sometimes I'm thinking in Russian, because my husband's Russian. We're sort of bilingual family. I'll notice that I was thinking in Russian because I get stuck because I'm missing a word. My thought gets stuck because I'm missing a word. Well, in a sense, the thought must have been running ahead because there must have been some word I'm looking for. But anyway, I do find myself, I'll have a thought and then I'll say, yeah, but that was ambiguous, or something. But I have no idea. I have no idea how to solve the problem of the kinds of thinking that goes on in non-language, of which the most familiar is often visual thinking. You can look at a puzzle and see how to solve it without there being any words in that kind of stuff. How to get between that and language is not, it's way beyond my pay grade. I have no idea. But for the part about Montague's mapping biasing us too much to interpretation rather than, I remember having the same question about Chomsky versus Zelig-Harris, because my very first introduction to transformational grammar was a summer seminar at Penn, at the University of Pennsylvania, when I was the year before I started graduate school. This is when I was just discovering linguistics. And we learned a little bit about Zelig-Harris's version of transformational grammar. And that was all analysis. That was all kind of parsing. You know, his idea was analyzing different sentences because he wanted to look for sentences that would be equivalent if they would parse into the same kind of structures in some sense, or have some common underlying structure. So learning transformational grammar at Penn was all about going from mapping sentences into what their syntactic structures must be. And then I got to MIT, and Chomsky wrote a big S on the board and put an NP and a VP under it. And we were building up sentences. I mean, it looked sort of like a production model if you thought of it that way. It was kind of random production, you know, just expand all those nodes in any possible way and you get to a sentence. And I thought, oh, I thought what we did in syntax was take a sentence and figure out what its structure was. And I remember some of us asked Chomsky, was there any difference between looking at it in terms of generating a sentence versus parsing a sentence? And he said no. It turned out it wasn't that easy. I mean, there was a difference, and so it was not always obvious how you would get from a Chomskyan transformational grammar to a parser, or vice versa. And it may very well be the same in the Montague grammar. I may be a little bit hasty in saying it can go equally well either way. But that's all I can say on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all for this active interaction with Professor Barbara Partee. Before we are wrapping up, Shigeto Kawahara from Keio will give a closing remark.
Yes, I think Barbara's talk make it clear that I was so wrong when I said Montague grammar was just about logic. But I think I was so right that she's a great teacher and a speaker. And I was also right about her smiles. Didn't you see this throughout her talk? That's what I meant in my introduction. So please join me with thanking Barbara again for making herself available for a talk. That's great. I loved it. I was right. My revelation was correct.
Thank you again for inviting me. I loved it.
Yeah. So.
And I liked all the questions. They were good. That was nice.
Yes, thank you all. Let me wrap up today's event, and we will stay for a few more minutes after that. First of all, today's slides during Barbara's talk are available in the link that was shared earlier. If you joined later, and we will share it one more time when we are actually sending out an announcement with the recordings of today's talk. The recording will be available on the ICU-Linguistics Lab YouTube channel, and you'll be free to distribute it to anybody who might be interested in watching the video. Again, that includes this question and answer session. I would like to thank the two assistants who were behind organizing this event, Michinori Suzuki and Migiwa. And this event was supported by the Institute of Cultural and Linguistic Studies at Keio University and the Linguistics Lab at International Christian University. And I'm Seunghun Lee from International Christian University. I have an advertisement. The plenary talk was part of a season 1 of Keio ICU Linguistic Colloquium series. We had 2 events already completed, and all the videos are available on the YouTube channel as well. Part 3 of the Keio ICU Linguistic Colloquium will be held on Wednesday, July 15. This is Japan time, so in the East Coast, it will be Tuesday and July 14th. Misaki Kato from University of Oregon and Claire Moore Cantwell from UCLA will deliver their recent research. And the last and the 4th part of the Keio ICU Linguistic Colloquium will be held on July 29th, 2 weeks from July 15th. Once again, thank you all who participated in today's plenary talk, and perhaps see you all on July 15th or July 29th. The recordings will stop now.